Welcome to a Thinking if you haven't been before. The aim is to use this, everyone in the room, as a driver of our journalism, to think where our journalism should go now. Normally we're quite sort of free-form jazz about the kind of order and structure of the conversation. Given that we've got quite so much to get through this morning, I'm actually going to give what Matt calls an order of service, because it seems as though we've got to get through quite a lot just to understand what's happened. I appreciate people sort of coming in. We're going to start at the top talking about the Conservative and Labour results. I then wanted to move to Scotland and have a think about the state of the UK now. It seems as though there's then the question about what happens to Brexit in a Whitehall sense as well as a Westminster sense, what's left of the centre and the results for the Lib Dems overnight. We'll then go back to another question on the UK front, which is Northern Ireland. What has this meant for politics there and its impact across the UK? And then we're going to try and look a little bit forward, particularly across what happens in terms of the Labour leadership. Is this a two-term victory for Boris Johnson? What does that mean in terms of the remaking of Labour? And finally, I think there are some big questions about media, culture, and the idea of class in the UK that have been thrown up by what happened yesterday. So, as you can see, that is what you would call 3 hours worth of conversation in the course of an hour. If you've not been before, hello. You've not been before. Agatha, our tortoise, makes her way across the screen. So we've got an hour. As I hope you know, the nature of thinking is that everyone should pipe up. Please join in. Let us know what you think. Some of it will be, as you can hear from me, emotional and not particularly well structured. There's a certain mixture of the force of the events and the lack of sleep that might make it that way. So please don't feel worried about that. Just do weigh in. But I'm going to lean a fair bit on my fellow editors, Polly Curtis and Matt Dancona and Chris Cook, and actually Dave, who's busy editing our stuff for the course of the day, Dave Taylor. But let me start by telling you this. And if you don't know, if you've not been here before, there are mics and cameras. So if you're going to have a kind of emotional outburst, great. It'll make for some really So at the beginning of the year, I was at lunch with George Osborne, who said that the Conservatives couldn't risk going to the polls in 2019. They would lose. They would most surely lose because the gravitational forces of politics were against them. That they were looking to win at the end of a political decade, and typically parties lose at the end of a political decade. He said that almost no parties can increase their majorities. If you look at the record of political parties over time, they come in big, and their authority and their mandate and their scores at the ballot box gradually decline. They almost never hockey stick up. He said that the big problem is that the London bubble thinks that Brexit is the issue of this general election, but 10 years of austerity is what's really going to move the dial in this election campaign. And anyone who is really tactical about election said it was an absolute spin of the roulette wheel to go in December. In December when it is wet and cold, in December when the days are shorter, in December when the older Tory vote won't come out, that this was a catastrophically risky thing to do. And I say all of that because the first thing to point out is that the Conservatives have won an extraordinary victory in pure political terms. The achievement of what they've done has not just surprised people, but bucked the expectations of those who have thought that such a victory, and even those who wanted it, thought that such a victory was impossible. So I was going to start, Matt, with you by trying to just explain to us, how did they do this?
I think one of the things they did was they stuck to something that they were mocked for almost every day, which was message discipline. It became part of the running joke of the campaign that every time Boris Johnson was asked, would you like a cup of tea? How many rows does a man walk down? You name it, he said, get Brexit done. And the media joined in the joke by just repeating it and talking about it. And this bears all the hallmarks of our friend Dominic Cummings, which is very important. Perhaps we'll talk about that a bit more during the conversation. But that message discipline and a manifesto that was actually very risk averse really didn't contain very much. There was a little bit of sway away from the austerity and fiscal conservatism of the Osborne years, but really there wasn't a huge offer. There wasn't a big retail offer. The offer was to conclude the campaign of Vote Leave in 2016, actually by getting the personnel of Vote Leave from 2016 to come and work in Downing Street. And they did that, and they did that with an amazing precision.
So I'm going to ask you, I know sometimes it must seem kind of bewildering why journalists and newsrooms fetishize certain people, particularly these sort of backroom strategists. And I think most people here know Dominic Cummings. He was played by Benedict Cumberbatch in the TV programme about Leave. But the really significant thing was here was someone, he came out, did you work with him at The Spectator?
No, he preceded me. He had caused bedlam before I arrived.
So he's a Spectator journalist. He then ends up being special advisor to Michael Gove.
And he'd been an advisor to Ian Duncan Smith as well, unbelievably.
That's right. And with Gove, particularly at the education department, they were really keen on taking on the union's fundamental reform of schools. He ends up being the pivotal figure who essentially purges Farage and Aaron Banks, etc., out of the Vote Leave process and keeps a discipline around Vote Leave, is the one who is widely credited for the message discipline around that, and then ends up not on Michael Gove's at Michael Gove's shoulder, but at Boris Johnson's in Downing Street earlier this summer. And I guess the question I've got, Matt, just on Dominic Cummings is, you can see that he's become one of these pivotal figures in British politics, a sort of Mandelson of the right now.
Yeah.
Do we know, though, what he believes in beyond Brexit? What's his philosophy of government, now that, in effect, he's got a mandate to leave the European Union and run the country for 5 years?
Well, he hates the traditional institutions of Whitehall and Brussels, and indeed almost everything else. He despises bureaucracy, and he believes that the reason things don't happen is because of bureaucratic inertia. And he's now in a position to do something about it. It's interesting because he said that he won't stay around very long after what's now happened, a Conservative victory. I wonder whether that's the case. And even if he doesn't stick around for very long, I'm sure he'll stay long enough to set a number of hairs running, which will be to do with slimming down the way that Whitehall works and getting rid of what he considers to be the philosophy of what he called in the education department the blob. He believes that people act in concert, vested interests, bureaucrats in the civil service, the judiciary, the media, they all conspire together to stop actually very straightforward things happening. And this is a very powerful belief. And, in the education department, it caused all sorts of mayhem. And now it will be the governing philosophy of Number 10.
Yeah, I should just say one of the really interesting puzzles this morning is you have a Johnson government now with a really significant mandate and majority, but a huge uncertainty about whether or not you've now got the UK equivalent of a Bannonite government with a social values agenda disguising, if you like, a small state economic agenda, or whether or not you're going to have a London mayor-style Boris who is going to be interventionist, more regulatory, big spender, big borrower. There's not actually that much clarity. What there is clarity, and Chris, if I may come to you, what there is clarity is about a very different map, a very different, if you like, constitution of the Conservative and Unionist Party. Have you got, by any happy chance, a completely incomprehensible graph?
Yeah. So there are two things here. So this is a simple graph.
This is the easy one. We're just warming you up.
So this is the 0 line here, right? So this is each dot represents a seat, and dots above the line show seats where the Tory vote went up, and dots below the line show seats where the Tory vote went down. And you can see dots that are further to the left are places where there are fewer people with degrees. Dots that are further to the right are places where there are more people with degrees. And what you can see is basically that they made huge advances, almost 20-point surges in seats where basically no one has a degree, or like 10% of people have a degree. They went backwards, they're below this line, in seats where large numbers of people have a degree. They've made really, I mean, they're becoming an unmetropolitan party. They're sort of being filtered out. And actually, when you look at we were looking at the map earlier, when you physically look at sort of a hexagram map, you can see these enormous clusters of red seats pocketing around the country. We talk about, the northeast having had this big Tory incursion. It's a big Tory incursion into like the outskirts of the cities, not into the cities themselves. And this really is why. Education is the fault line in 2016, it's the fault line in 2017, it's the fault line in 2019. If you have a degree, you stand on one side of a line. If you don't, you stand on the other.
And can you just explain that in a second? Because Katie was saying, Katie Bannock-Smith is my co-founder, having a cup of tea. Katie, you were just saying what your mum thought about our email this morning, making the point about what was the phrase we used, the poorly educated or the undereducated? Less educated. Yeah. So just, Katie, will you just explain what that's?
She took umbrage, did Mrs. Lee. You know she did. Mm-hmm. But then I think is one of those things where she felt, as a non-metropolitan urban elite, that it was the non-metropolitan urban elite labelling her as less educated, and her point was, it's not an indicator of my intellect.
No, it's not. But it's an indicator of your.
The way we talk about it sometimes can be misrepresented and misunderstood.
So, education captures age. So, if you're a younger person, you're much more likely to have got higher qualifications. It captures class, because if you're from a tougher background, you're less likely to have got formal education, and it captures geography too. So, if you're from a sort of what clichédly is now called the left behind area, you're less likely to have qualifications, even if you're still on those things. So it's doing a lot of capturing. It's not just about education, but people with less credentialed education are more likely to basically be Tories.
And Chris, can you just say, because I'm sure lots of people remember that Donald Trump moment where, in 2016, he said, "I love the poorly educated." And obviously, a lot of people find that really distasteful. But there is something significant in that if this had happened, or in fact when it did happen in the Thatcher years, when it happened in with the Reagan Democrats, we talked about the right capturing the vote of the working class, right? Is there a reason we don't talk about that anymore?
It's partly because we don't really talk about class effectively anymore. Like we don't, when we think of. I mean, one of the really good things that's happened in the UK in the last 30 years is we've taken people out of coal mines and off fishing ships, and we've put them in call centres, right? So they don't die at work, they don't get black lung, they get paid more, they have a higher esteemed job, but we don't think of that as sort of good working class work, and we're sort of sheepish about. I think we'd all have to think for a moment before we decided what a person working in a call centre was. It's actually not totally clear how we'd categorise them. Yeah. So that's part of the issue, is that we don't have a clear categorisations on class anymore. We have another.
Hold on, can you just do one thing? So I'm just going to ask Polly a question on this. Because we did this run of think-ins around the country. Polly, you were in Grimsby 3-4 weeks ago.
4 weeks since the election.
Just on the specific issue though about class, because I do think that this is going to redefine the debate about how we organise, how we think about communities and constituencies. And we've planned this run of think-ins next year, specifically on an examination of class. What do you draw from this?
On what Chris is saying, I don't think we understand what class means anymore, and all the kind of signifiers of what class is, from education to jobs to even income, is really poorly understood. And I think what I saw in Grimsby, where we went and did 4 think-ins with like a really broad range of people and built up quite a brilliant kind of tortoise membership in Grimsby, was that people's kind of identity as a really entrenched Labour town was shifting, and people were saying, well, my grandma voted Labour, my mum voted Labour, all my friends voted Labour, and I can't vote Labour. And they were fleeing in all different directions. That vote was really fracturing, and I think the alignment with the class issue is also around what Labour has stood for. So things like unions, the link with the unions. If you are working in very flexible work, if you don't have much workers' rights, that doesn't really play into the same narrative around Labour and unions anymore. So, I mean, people were very openly talking about identity changing in this election.
And there's another.
The result, by the way, in Great Grimsby, it was a Labour hold going in, and the Tories took it
By a
massive
mile.
margin. They ended up with 18,000 votes, and Leon got 10,000.
I mean, the other thing is there's hard economics here, right? One of the big thing we don't really talk enough about is something that economists call skills bias technical change, which means that if you have a higher education level, your average productivity growth has been much higher over the last 30, 40 years.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, let's do that again.
So lawyers
This is thinking there's a test at the end.
lawyers who have better IT are been able to get more productive progressively faster than the people who clean their offices. So their wages have been able to diverge dramatically. So, and it's a sort of problem across everything. So the technology for people with technology invested in supporting people who have with less education. Sorry, let me start again. The amount of widgets that people with low education can produce at work per hour hasn't risen as fast as the number of widgets that people with high education can do. So their wages have drifted apart. So if you're one of the people over here, you basically think the EU has been great, we've had globalisation, things have gone well. If you're over here, this has all been a disaster, you've seen wage segregation.
Okay, so can we do, so does anyone want to weigh in at this stage just on what we've touched so far?
I just want to ask Chris a question, sorry to put you on the spot, but the dot on the left, the outlier, where's that?
And find out, but give me like 2 minutes.
Or do you want to go to the, if anyone has thoughts, yes, sir.
I'll say something briefly about the
Will you just introduce yourself?
Sam.
Our taxi driver.
No, I know very well, but Sam was here last night. I just thought it would be a good model, you know, like...
The workers' rights, that's an interesting point. I come from 4 generations of, I'm a 4th generation Labour voter, but I can't vote for this Labour Party. Labour should be attracting those votes because there's been a rolling back of workers' rights in kind of working class occupations, like mine, and Labour are not attracting those votes because I think that they're too left-wing, frankly. I think that the people who ought to be that natural constituency are not attracted to that left-wing politics because it's too just hard left. And it didn't win in 1983, didn't win in the 1970s. I don't think that politics is ever going to win in the UK.
Right, well, should we go to Labour, or do you want to do your slide quickly and then we'll go to Labour?
That dot is Perth and North Perthshire.
Perth and North Perthshire. This is Chris Newell, by the way. We rarely let him out, but, but on a special occasion, after a full night doing gross on the general election, here he is. He is the maestro of all our data visualisations.
So if we go to the next, so I've shown you, I think, again, you've seen our things before, you've seen this graph before. So this shows the seats as they stood yesterday morning. So these are the 2017 results. And they're arranged from left, which is the safest Tory seats, to the right, which are the safest Labour seats. The ones in the middle, near the sort of zero line, are the marginals, right? So if the Tories can push this line a bit farther this way, they capture the seats there. If the Labour Party can move the line just this way, they capture the seats there. They're arranged up and down by how Leavey or Remainy they are. So the ones at the top here, these are safe Tory seats up here, which with very large Leave votes. These are safe Labour seats down here with very large Remain votes, right? So what happened last night? We have another, if we move the slide over, well, these are the seats that changed hands. So you can see the Tories pushed dramatically over, in some of these places, I don't know why that's gone red, but they pushed dramatically over into these seats over here. they made more headway in places that were leavier. That's the sort of intuition here. And you can see that the yellow dots are all SNP seats. You can see the SNP just sweeping through. They basically absorbed a huge number of ex-Labour voters. So they just rose everywhere and took them all out. So this is the progress they made here. And these numbers are huge, right? So these are sort of 20-point like gaps they've made up in 2 years. And they've made it up because they've been able to get to these, convince these Leave voters that this is the way to end the impasse.
And can I just say, this is, so if you're a follower of these things, I don't know whether you've followed Chris's trademarked incomprehensible graph that we've run every week for the last few weeks, which has mapped the target seats that the Tories were looking at and the visits by Boris Johnson into those seats and the Facebook spend targeted those seats. There are two things to say. One is that this is a clinical execution of strategy by the Conservatives, so that they have done exactly what Chris was describing for the last 4 weeks, which was aiming at that corner where there were Leave Labour seats. And this was a direct assault on Labour heartlands, but very specifically. And if you look at that, it almost exactly mirrors the graph that you put out 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago even, which was look at the triangle. It nails it exactly. And so what you are going to see and hear is a lot more from Chris for being very smart, but particularly from Isaac Levido, because you very, very rarely see campaigns executed with that kind of clinical accuracy. All right, so thank you very much, Chris. This has just all been a warm-up for what is, if you like, the main course. And let me just give you a sort of taste of the main course. Burnley, Bolsover, Blythe Valley, Darlington, Swindon, Nuneaton, Redcar, Lee. The idea that these places have Conservative members of Parliament, if you could do an accumulator bet on that 4 weeks ago, we wouldn't be here. We would be selling ourselves somewhere else. So let's just talk about that for a second. This is a staggering win for the Conservative Party in execution and political messaging. It's possibly even more remarkable as a failure of Labour.
Yeah.
And Matt, again, why don't you just start and try and, if you can, give us a sense of the context of it, but specifically what you think was the driver of it. Sam points to a bit of it, but what do you think?
Well, I think when you think about it, obviously, for most of the night, and I think the real disaster for the Labour Party was how well they did in 2017. Because from that they concluded that Corbynism was a runner, and that one more heave might do it. And in fact, the opposite was true. Corbynism was a flash in the pan. They had one great album, and then the second album was a total disaster. And there's a lot of noise around that, it was only because he was forced into adopting a second referendum position, and people made a fuss about anti-Semitism. Actually, think about it. If he hadn't kept those Remainer votes on the side, then the Lib Dems would have done even better than they did. So the reality is the problem with Corbyn was Corbyn. He was a terrible leader. He gave a really bad name to socialism. There are varieties of socialism that could actually, do okay on the doorstep. But by the end, he had been found out, and specifically because he was so uninterested in the art of persuasion. What really interested him was announcing to people how brilliant he was, and then getting on with the business of controlling the Labour Party, which was his complete and utter obsession. And of course, looking forward, that is a huge problem for Labour, because even as Corbyn goes, the people around him continue to control the National Executive Committee, the committees that decide on conference agendas. It will have an impact on the leadership election, you can bet. So Corbyn was the problem. And, it was interesting, last night we had a quiz, and the question that no one could get the answer to was, what was Labour's slogan during the election? Any ideas?
No, for the many, not the few.
Right.
Something to do with change.
Yeah,
You were
well, you
here
were there, you know now, but you were there. I mean, that's cheating, but I mean...
It's time for real change, which ironically pretty much every member of the Labour Party thinks now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to give a sense, because I want to dig into what people think is going to happen in Labour, what they think they'd like to see in Labour, but actually before I do that, Dave, without giving too much of the game away, will you just say kind of what you're working on today?
Yeah, we've got a piece that we're going to run on Saturday, which is based on a journalist we know who's been digging deep into the Labour campaign for the last 4 weeks, and he's had sources inside there telling him at various stages what's been happening. Just to give you a flavour of it, he says that what you had was the apparatchiks from Corbyn's office that kind of migrated across into headquarters for the campaign, and out in the real world, candidates, canvassers, and even officials in party headquarters were making daily warnings that the party was heading for losses rather than gains, but they ploughed on regardless, throwing money at unwinnable targets and basically ignoring Labour-held marginals that they'd taken for granted. And he's got this quote from one insider who said it was the kamikaze battle plan. So that's what they were.
But I think, I think that, the reason I wanted to mention that they've done that, when you have a night like last night where the outcome is not a total shock as in a Conservative majority, but the nature of it is, actually journalistically, you're certainly left a little bewildered in the early hours because you think, well, we either say something that everyone else is going to say, or you do one of those chin strokes that gives you a sort of historic perspective, but let's face it, we only get 7 paragraphs into those stories. And then Dave shows up and goes, oh, no, I asked Phil at the beginning of the campaign to get inside the arguments between Team Corbyn and the rest of the Labour Party machine, so we could tell the story of how it's the anatomy of a catastrophe. And so that is both in the podcast that we do today and in the story that you'll see run tomorrow, gets into the sort of the really molecular who's who of how this happened. Of course, there's an element to it which is not machinery; it's about message and the messenger. So I just thought we should just pause and just have a reflection on what we think in the room about how that Labour catastrophe unfolded. What were the drivers of it? Does anyone have any things they want to weigh in at this point? Chris, do you have anything that you can summon from the depths of sleep deprivation?
One of the things that's really striking is the two things that are really striking are that they didn't run the same campaign as last time. So I don't know if you remember that they had quite a cute sort of thing they did last time around, which was they'd send him to strange places and he would do enormous rallies and it would get on the local TV news. And it's a sort of a TV cliche that the most watched news is your local bulletin at 6:30. It's not the main bulletins at 6 o'clock. And people trust local news in a way that they don't. So you never hear people. You hear people slag off Laura Koonsberg. You don't hear people slag off like Gordon Rayner or like the other local reporters. And I don't mean Gordon Rayner, do I? Anyway, you know what I mean. It's like they had a strategy built around this idea that you go to strange places, but you get brilliant pictures, which would be seen obviously in the marginals because they're on TV. He was remarkably sort of torpid this time, I thought. He sort of didn't do any of that stuff. They didn't use this sort of skill set he has for these sort of big events. There was much less of it. And that was the sort of first oddity. Something that seemed to work last time, they didn't try again. And the second thing was just that it was like the patience ran out with him as well, like with the public. So that come on, he's just a sort of sleepy old guy. Like all of this stuff about he's a vegetarian from Islington, right? We know what that is. Like we all have a sort of model in our minds. Like Dave. Dave, right? We fit people into boxes, and he sort of fit neatly into a box. He's a type that we all knew, and people didn't think the worst of him because they're like Dave, right? It's electing Dave. Yeah, fantastic. But all of this sort of now that he was sort of introduced to the public, they knew who he was, and then the sort of drip feed of the last 2 years, the anti-Semitism problem, everything else. Yeah. bit into it. So it was, you know.
I think there's something as well about, sorry,
Go ahead, Mark.
about cutting through the mechanics of the campaign and just looking at the two leaders. And I think that's probably what a lot of people were doing. And you know, Johnson is a complete shit, but everybody knows what kind of shit he is. It's a very transparent kind of shit. Whereas people, I think, yeah, that was a horrible image. But whereas with Corbyn, you don't, like, I think people don't have so many questions about him, and he hasn't been open, and he doesn't talk very much. And I think, you know, all the anti-Semitism claims really stuck, because that's exactly what he's not meant to be. Whereas Boris Johnson, you know that he is all those bad things. So I think there's something about the kind of honesty of leadership that really cut through all the mechanics and just appeal to people on a human level.
Yeah, I think there's quite a nice sort of human lesson for us in all this, which is if you look at the last two people who've been sort of gradually ground down by politics, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, one of the traits that they've got in common is that they're both extremely secretive and closed. And there is a lesson in that, I think, which is in today's world, being secretive and closed doesn't work. Sorry?
Essentially quite
decent people, yes. So, yeah.
Just building on that honesty point, is it also possible that Corbyn overplayed the degree to which he is radical and his policies are radical? He sort of dresses himself up as this big revolutionary. But actually, when you look underneath it, a lot of the policies that were underlying that were actually relatively middle of the road. He was planning to bring the UK roughly to the centre ground in terms of Europe, in terms of state spending.
Yeah.
So he's playing this position as him putting himself out there as this big radical leader, but people aren't buying it. I'm fascinated.
No, I was obsessed by this, and the thing that was really interesting is when you try to put to Labour people, it says, if you look at your tax policy, it is a carbon copy of Blair Brown's tax policy.
It's pretty normal.
And even the argument would be if you try to renationalise at least the railways and arguably water, with Tony Blair fronting that up, you very well could have landed it. So I think there is a great deal in that. There's something in that personality. Sorry, Lisa, you can say something.
Yeah, I'm Lisa.
And so, what's your name?
Gus.
Yeah.
I'm Lisa. I think there's another thing that relative closeness does, which is it enables people to project their own imaginings about Corbyn onto him.
Yeah.
And I was actually out. I'm Jewish, and I was also out campaigning for Labour in Kensington because I think Emma Dent-Cote there did deserve to win. And what was really interesting on both sides is the ideas that people project onto Corbyn. So if you talk to sort of younger, sort of people who are very enthusiastic about him, they talk about his anti-imperialism, they see their hopes in him in a way for something that they haven't heard talked about by politicians before. If you talk to people in sort of, I would say in the Jewish community that I grew up in Northwest London, they see someone very scary who wants there to be a genocide.
Yeah.
And his failure, and you know, and I've actually seen people sort of saying that sort of thing, and that.
Well, that's to Matt's point, isn't it? That was a plus in 2017 because you could project X, but it was a clear problem. So, Michelle, you were going to say? Yes, I'll come to Michelle first behind you, and then you, sir.
Okay. So I'm Michelle. I actually work at Salters. So I'm from near Burnley, in the next constituency. And I've seen on social media this morning people absolutely whooping with joy that Corbyn is out and Conservative is in, but it's all about Brexit for them. It's quite a deprived area, Burnley. It needs investment in schools, hospitals, community, and all of that's gone to one side, and for them it was all about Brexit, and that's why they're so delighted. It's come down to that one single issue for them.
Very good. Sorry, sir.
I'm Paul. Just going back to Matt's point about why was Corbyn so popular in 17 and not now, it struck me that it's an element of for him being not a politician in 2017. He's regarded as something completely different. now in 2019, he's just another
He's
politician.
another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
One of the
interesting.
things that pops up in this piece as well is that his equivocation over the Salisbury poisoning as well has really hit home on doorsteps, and that people have felt that's unpatriotic and actually can't be trusted.
That's it. You took, sorry, there's a gentleman here, sorry.
Yeah, I'm Andy from the EBI newspaper. What's kind of, when you did the slide about the demographics, that was clearly a tribal play. I mean, no one's kind of mentioned tribalism as yet. But with that kind of, Trump's America, that easy sell, kind of capturing the emotional kind of issues of a nation that are, disenfranchised about something, which Trump, of course, does so well. So going back to that kind of duality between what Boris can offer and what a Corbyn can offer, what Theresa May couldn't offer. Boris can have a tribal following because he makes it very, very simple to a population that are hungry to be angry about something.
Yeah.
Corbyn couldn't do it because he was on the fence. He wasn't this, he was that, and he couldn't label himself with anything that anybody could actually get behind. And I'd be interested in actually obviously it will come up eventually, but what role social media played in,
We'll do that.
in that, a bigger subject probably.
But Andy, let's come back to that. Let's just currently mark our own homework. We've got 8 subjects to cover. We've done about 1.5. So we're going to rattle into a few others, and then we are going to round back to that one. I think we should definitely do Scotland. So, Chris, should we just start with what happened last night?
So, I mean, the big things, obviously, the SNP were the big beneficiaries of the collapse of the Labour Party. So that everyone else sort of stood still in Scotland, but the SNP suddenly shot up as Labour fell back. Labour's been knocked back to one solitary seat, their sort of fortress in Edinburgh South. The big thing here is that obviously the SNP spent the last 2 weeks both saying voting for us isn't a vote for another referendum, and then obviously immediately saying, obviously this proves the need for another referendum as soon as the vote came in. So they're in this sort of, and they have this sort of slightly awkward game they have to play where you have to send SNP MPs to London to stand up for Scotland, and then trying to use unionist votes for the SNP on that basis to get permission for what's called the Article 30 process. So Article 30 is it's not Article 50, it's a new terrible thing that can happen to our country. The Scottish Parliament doesn't have the right to call the referendum on its own. It has to seek the permission of the government in London. Boris has said he absolutely refused to grant it. The thing is, they've got 45% of the vote this time round. They've got the bulk of the MPs. There is an election in 2021 for Holyrood. If there is another pro-independence majority in the 2020-21 in the Scottish Parliament, it will be quite difficult. So that's SNP plus Green. It'll be quite difficult to sort of hold the line. You could end up in a sort of Catalan situation where there's sort of a serious constitutional standoff between the centre and the periphery, and that'd be horrendous. Just terrible.
And the reason the Catalan comparison seems more viable than it did yesterday morning is that a Johnson majority which is sufficient to block any referendum and a Sturgeon majority.
The wiping out of loads of Tories in Scotland. So it is a more English government than it felt yesterday as well.
Yeah.
So the loss of all those Ruth Davidson's lovely Liberal Tories who are going to stand up to Boris, all gone. It's only basically the right-wing Tories who are left, who are up on the fishing towns in the northeast.
So let's just touch on that. And so there's a clear strain and a question about a second referendum.
And there's a ticking clock as well, which is Alex Salmond is going to go to trial in the beginning of next year about a series of horrendous offences that he's alleged to have committed, and he of course denies. They all relate to his time as First Minister when Nicola Sturgeon was his deputy. You don't have to believe he's guilty to believe that the process is going to air a lot of things about the inside of a very secretive and quite strange small party, which could really damage the SNP next.
So can I just put you on the spot for a second, Chris? If I had to ask you which we're going to see is going to be the next vote in the UK, is it more likely to be some kind of ballot on Scottish independence in Scotland or a general election?
Scottish independence.
Okay, that's what you call a direct answer. Yeah.
I know we're not supposed to ask questions, but what is the...
Will you just say who you are,
Oh,
Tess?
sorry, it's Tessa, at George's. So let's just work through that a wee bit. Would Scotland be able to... What's the process for Scotland to reapply to Europe?
So there's a... they'd have to go through an accession process, is the short answer. It's still like you have to go through what everyone else goes through. You have to sort out your currency arrangements. You have to get your debt in a reasonable position. No.
They have to be an independent nation before they can do that.
They'll be out.
Yeah, sure. But you know, is there an implicit vote for rejoining of Europe?
So one of the really big things is that there are two big difficulties for them coming over the next sort of 2 years in making this case. The first is there are loads and loads of people who are pro-independence who hate the European Union. So those like Peterhead fishermen who are now voting Tory are never going to vote to join the European Union because it destroyed the fisheries for them, as far as they're concerned. Scotland would be nuts to choose fishing over any other industry, but you know, there you go. They also, so it's more likely that an independent Scotland would probably join the EEA, so they could keep the fishing stuff. But it's quite difficult to go into a campaign if you're sort of pretending to be a lovely liberal and not a secessionist nationalist, without being able to say we're going to the EU and everything would be fine and great, and take the sort of Edinburgh solicitor sort of strain of nationalists with you.
And Chris, sorry, I'm going to just keep going on. Just sort of, it's one of the most striking things that Theresa May did when she first walked into Downing Street was cast herself as a conservative and unionist and proud unionist. And just putting Scotland on hold for a second, what happened overnight in Northern Ireland, and what kind of conservative government do we have vis-a-vis the four nations of the UK?
So there's one, I keep saying, one objectively really good thing happened in Northern Ireland last night, which is that the SDLP took 2 seats, the Alliance took 1, and this means that people who are not the DUP will be in our Parliament, it will be a much more representative of opinion in Northern Ireland, and that can only be a good thing, especially if you're a unionist. Right? They got rid of Nigel Dodds, which will reduce the average IQ of the DUP delegation of MPs by about 80%.
It will reduce it.
Yeah, he's the clever one. I mean, Ian Paisley Jr. and Sandy Wilson are going to be the senior people in the Westminster delegation to London.
But we've passed the high water mark of Arlene Foster on TV, surely. The DUP is much less relevant in the world.
So the DUP is much less relevant, other than the fact it's still the biggest party that turns up to Westminster. There's a thing that people keep talking about, which is there's a thing in Northern Irish unionism about the countdown, right? So there's this thing that they watch the number of Sinn Féin and SDLP MPs creeping up, and when it hits a majority, they're terrified that this means there'll be a border poll and that'll be it. You know, they'll lose and it'll be over. It's really important to remember that Northern Irish nationalism is really moderate, and they don't want to have a border poll unless they're going to win really heavily for the most part. It's going to be quite hard to... The SDLP has a sort of theology about this, which is that you don't want to win by 50% plus 1. You know, you want to win big because you have to take the Protestants with you because they are Irish too, and they have to make a new nation together. So I think Irish unity is much further off the cards than
it was.
Than people think it is. Like it's coming. Like it's being sped up, but it's a really long way down the track.
Okay, I'm going to just ask the room here. Who here was surprised at the number of seats that the Lib Dems ended up with? Who here thought they were going to do better? Who here thinks they know the reason why they didn't do better? Okay, let's ask the gentleman back there, sir.
I think
so, could you say your name?
Tom.
Tom.
I'm sorry. They tagged everything to the leader of the party, and she came across as ineffectual and rather lightning. And I think had they focused on the team, they might have got away with it, but they didn't. And I think that was the catastrophic mistake they made.
Do you think, Tom, out of interest, do you think if we become the government, we revoke Brexit automatically? Do you think that was tactically a mistake?
That was probably a mistake, but I think the focus on the leader was the
bigger mistake.
And yet, I mean, doesn't he come across as rather lightweight as well? And the different standards that are in play.
Who's he?
He, Johnson.
Oh, Boris Johnson. So the gentleman back there.
Brett. My name's Brett. I think if you think about it tactically, then yeah, if you want to gain a few seats, saying we're going to take us or keep us in Europe was a mistake by the Dems. They were shoving all in on a 2 and a 7. It's like, well, I either win this whole thing or I don't. And I think that was the only way they were going to overturn the kind of difference in the seats that are around at the moment. So from my point of view, I think it was a perfectly legitimate thing. Boom or bust. They just happened to bust.
I mean, I think there's also worth remembering that they made the pledge when Labour was in a funnier place. So it might have been when it wasn't clear what Labour was going to do. It might have worked. The other thing is they must have. I mean, I looked at when we had about data on about 500 seats, and they had, I think, quadrupled at that point the number of seats where they were in second place. Like they've massively increased their vote share overnight. I mean, it's just because of our they went last time, the last election, they dropped the number of votes they got down from about 7.5% to 7% and went up from 8 MPs to 12. They've increased by about 4% this time and then have gone down again. Like they're sort of victims of our incredibly terrible election system.
So you were going to say? Yes. So what's your name?
Lulu.
Lulu.
So I think on the one hand, yeah, I think there's nothing to be said for that it was ridiculous, and I've been a Lib Dem voter for about 10 years, that we did make more things like Luciana, particularly Chucker. But I think also we just had this completely unclear messaging. Like, people were confused about what they were getting with Brexit because we were flip-flopping between, like, second referendum if we were part of a coalition or, you know, just revoking it. And I think we were also really unclear about what we would do in the event of a hung parliament. Like, would we work with Labour or not? People just didn't know what they were voting for when they were voting for the Liberal Democrats. So we ended up being both divisive and unclear, which is a really toxic message that won't win you any votes.
Yeah, yeah. And what do you feel, Lulu, if you've been a follower of the Lib Dems in terms of... One of the problems with being a losing party is you, by definition, have a losing leader, in this case, in every sense, but also a much smaller gene pool to pick your next leader from. So what do you think happens, and what would you like to see happen to the Lib Dems in terms of leadership choice?
Personally, I think at this stage, Ed Davey's probably our best shout because he's someone who's been around a long time. He has cabinet experience, which not many Lib Dem MPs can say. He has a lot of support from the party, if not quite as much as Joe had. And like he has actually done a lot for the environment. Like I think he has quite a good standing, and from the very limited pool of options we have, I think he's probably our best bet.
The reason I mentioned it is that we had a think-in here with a bunch of people on the nature of the Lib Dems in the spring. Sal Brinton, now your acting leader, I don't know whether you're still a Lib Dem, sorry to assume, but yeah,
yes,
Sal Brinton was very, very interesting on the subject of the leadership contest. Right? Her point was, A, do we want to have a much broader membership? Should people be able to just sign up and join, right? So we can have a much broader pool of members? And do you need to be a member of the parliamentary party? Do you need to have a seat in order to be the leader of the Lib Dems? And so I think that when Ed Davey and Sal Brinton get together, there'll be quite a meaty conversation, because his interest is obviously in keeping quite a small selection process, and hers might be in doing something broader. All right, I'm going to do one thing. Sorry, Sam, you're going to say?
Very briefly then about Remain.
Yeah.
I think it was a massive mistake, the revoke policy. But Remain lost last night. I was very sad because I voted Remain, and I just immediately, when I saw the size of the Tory majority, I thought that's it. That's the end of Remain now. And I think that it's Labour's fault and it's the Lib Dems' fault, because Labour, you know, were too left wing, and you see a lot of Labour messaging, we hate the Lib Dems, the Lib Dems voted for this, the Lib Dems voted for that, don't vote Lib Dem. It was just very divisive. It was overtly divisive, really on both sides, and so I do think that revoke position was ludicrous. I think it was anti-democratic.
Yes.
So I'm sad today because
Yeah.
it's the end of Remain.
It is the end of Remain. Well, let's just touch down on that. Brexit is going to happen. That's one thing that's clear. What is Brexit now?
So it might be easier for him to start betraying people again.
Happy news.
So if you think he's got this problem, that there's this incredibly dangerous feature to the withdrawal agreement, which is that it says that the transition period will last to December. We can get an extension, but we have to ask for the extension by July. So at the moment when we'll be asking, it will feel like we've got months left to negotiate. The moment that first deadline in July passes, we will suddenly be against a hard deadline and it's going to be hard to politically get the will to ask for an extension in July, even if it's very clear that things aren't going well. It's easier for him now to delay because it's going to be 5 years, or 4.5 years to the next election, and so that's good news. He's no longer reliant on the complete headbangers, just like the.
So because that's an important thing. Is it the case that the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage, when Remain dies, so does their political mission? Are we going to see the sort of the quietening of Nigel Farage? Do we think?
I wouldn't say so.
Really?
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, that's something to look forward to. And then the second thing is, on Brexit, just so we're clear, what we're really talking about is the deal that he previously did with the border down the Irish Sea.
Yeah, and what we are still heading towards, we have an odd situation where now our leverage, such as it was that we would devastate the Irish economy.
Right.
So if we went over the edge, it would take Ireland with us. We've now created a situation where if we go over the edge, we don't take Ireland with us.
Right.
Right? So
but what you said,
we have no leverage, but we can still go over the edge.
I get that. But the interesting thing there is that what you said about the composition of the Northern Ireland representation in Parliament means that it could have been a very different picture this morning, where you were having a Brexit deal with a border down the Irish Sea that, as you say, left Ireland in a different set of economic arrangements, and a representation in Parliament, right, that didn't have such a strong unionist pull. So
it's worth pointing out that the all of the parties. So if you look at Catholic and Protestant approaches to the deal, the Catholics hate it more than Protestants. Because they are more. It's because they are more grateful for the Good Friday Agreement and are more nervous about stuff that will upset Good Friday.
All right. So I'm going to just, if I can, Meripy, come to you, because we had this conversation on Tuesday. We have a lunchtime thinking here where we just talk about what's current in the news, and we had a long trip round the houses on the general election, and typically got to the thing that really sparked off right at the end when we started talking about the nature of the media coverage and trust in the public square. And I wondered, Meripy, whether sort of with little sleep and a bit of reflection, you think that this is going to sort of get washed away? People will say, look, the result is the result, we all move on, or whether or not you think there will be a kind of lasting lesson in terms of media, both broadcast and press, and also social media.
I mean, the result is so decisive that I think it will get washed away. But with the point of us having on Tuesday, it was just after sort of 24 hours of two big sort of falsehood stories, which the first one was the sort of punch that wasn't, if people know what I'm talking about there, and the second one was the boy in the coats and whether that picture was faked. And it's impossible to say what kind of impact those stories had on the electorate, but it's just interesting how quickly you see them virally go through social media, and the tribalism behind those sorts of campaigns, and it just sort of struck me that we were in a different place where just lies are just the norm. I mean, we did that. Tortoise did that sort of great graphic which showed everyone was, the Tories had the most lies, but it's not just the campaigns. It's the tribes, and
it's the tribes, it's the proxies,
and that is the norm. And unfortunately, I think the decisiveness of the vote means that everyone will just say, "This is life now," and I find that really, really difficult. In the middle of that sort of 24 hours, I was sort of quite upset by it all, because you could see reputable journalists sort of getting involved in it, and everyone sort of buzzing to be first, and it was a sort of hysteria fed by nonsense, and then you get a result like this, and I just think, well, I guess that's the way we live now.
I think one of the most depressing things that's happened in the last 4 years is the change in the meaning of the word plain speaking.
Yeah.
Because it used to mean tells the truth. And as journalists, we must never lose that part of our covenant, that we must check facts and verify things and seek evidence and back up our claims with ever more evidence. However, I think it is the case now that when people say someone is plain speaking, they don't mean he's telling the truth. What they mean is he or she sees me.
Yeah.
And that is what Trump did with a kind of brutal brilliance. And I think in his own way, Johnson did it too, which was a lot of people that we were surprised that should happen to felt that he saw him. They saw him. It was seen by him.
Any thoughts? I just want to make sure we get any views on this from anyone in the room. Yes, Charles. Sorry, this is my colleague Charles Mattel.
I have had a bit of sleep.
Yes.
I'm a bit more optimistic. I think the size of the majority and Johnson's character means that he will tolerate dishonesty and sleaze, and there'll be a lot for us to report on.
Do you think anyone cares about that? Because evidence from the American election and this one is that people don't.
People don't care.
They don't.
There's an interesting strategic lesson in how to cover sleaze, because the New York Times and the Post have got in this pissing match where they've done incremental reporting and branded as scoops every tiny little mini and non-scoop. And I think what we could do is husband it a little and then really hit them between the eyes.
Okay, that sounds great. These are the merits of sleep. Andy, yes.
I think it will be interesting to know what the BBC do now. In the paper this morning, in our paper, we had a great thing with the journalists to all give their ideas about what should happen now. And one of the great ideas was that the BBC now have to be given the kind of opportunity to stop competing for audience and ratings and popularity and go back to the nuts and bolts news, which presents facts, which give at least the population a very clear, obvious place to go to. Now we have the new norm, as you were saying. Everyone expects people to lie, but it seems that it's okay.
Yeah.
You know, normally 10 years ago we would be going absolutely nuts about the stuff we're seeing.
I suspect you're right. I suspect there's a real argument there. So I'll come to you. I'll come to you, Paul.
My name's Vincenzo. One of the problems that I saw in this election, which is quite worrying.
Vincenzo, will you just speak up so people can hear you?
One of the problems I saw in this election, which I think is a real problem, is the idea that politicians don't even have to show up. So someone like Boris Johnson doesn't even have to come and do the interviews or the accountability, and that maybe is a problem for the media, and you could push that to one side and say, actually, there's enough interviews, there's enough news, but we've seen that him dodging Parliament even before the election, and I think that part of the problem is to what extent that will expand and continue.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think Andy's right. I think we are going to have a real set of questions about the relationship between traditional and mainstream media, and a lot of those things like interview formats. We actually, one of the things that we did in the last week, Polly was on the Cairncross review, so we've had to try and have a serious think about what we actually argue for, and even amongst ourselves we obviously don't agree. Personally, I think that there's a really strong argument now for looking at the banning of political advertising during the course of an election campaign on social media. That's always been our policy in broadcast media. I don't see why it doesn't exist in social media. And that we take action, you know, that there's legislation on digital harassment, which we seem to allow in a way that we don't in real life, and that we have expectations in terms of public standards of platforms that we have in terms of public interest for the press or public service for broadcasters. There needs to be a set of standards, it seems, for platforms too. And I agree with you, Andy, I think there will be a look at what's the next generation of mission to explain. Is it mission to examine? What would that be? We've run out of time, but we're going to give ourselves one exemption, which is that the question that will concern many people, particularly Labour voters, but actually everyone, is what now for everyone else? If you're not a Conservative voter, is there an offer that is different, and that will depend in a noticeable part on the leadership of the Labour Party. So I'm going to come to you, Matt, and then you finally, Polly. Just tell us what happens now. Who runs? How do you win the leadership of the Labour Party?
Okay, well,
what's the offer?
The mechanics of the leadership contest are as follows. That you have to get, in order to be a candidate, you have to secure 10% of the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is presently 203, and or the European Parliamentary Labour Party, which is presently 10. So, you know, do the maths, it's 10% of 213. And you have to get 10% of them, but you also additionally now have to get a percentage of the affiliated organisations, which is a code for union backing. So in order to get into the game, you need a bit of union backing and some MPs. So what you'll see now is a mad rush to secure those quanta, and also at the same time a very, very dexterous game of ideological positioning, because the absolute worst thing for the non-Corbynites to do is to present themselves as retro Blairites. I mean, that is death in a million wrappers. What someone like, let's say, Jess Phillips or Keir Starmer, whoever emerges as the moderate candidate, has to do is be a future-facing candidate. And Pat McFadden actually was saying over the weekend, Labour only wins, really, when it's the party of the future. 1945, 1964, 1997. The next Labour Prime Minister will be someone who doesn't say, hey, let's go back to the 1970s of Venezuela. It was amazing, right? I think we've stress tested that one to destruction, right? It's going to be someone, and which is not to say, by the way, that the person who will be the next Labour leader will be a future-facing person. But that's the candidate to vote for.
Polly.
I'm going to take that in two very quick ways. One is, I think what Johnson was talking about in his speech this morning was about trust. And that word came up again and again. And I think he is going to own the trust capital on the 31st of January when we leave the EU. And I think that is going to deliver to all the people he promised to. And then I think all the details about how we actually leave, I think might fade into people's background, and so I think that's an incredible strategy for him, except at some point the shit will hit the fan. And sorry, I'm talking about shit.
This time not transparent, though. Really, really shitty shit. Yeah.
And the reality of Brexit will be on his watch. And what happens at that point, so the rebuilding of Labour has got to play into that moment. And just on a kind of much more personal note, my family WhatsApp group this morning is all like, what the hell do we do now? And there is a very strong conversation about politics. There's a line in it, politics is not just political. What can you do in your own life to contribute and do something different?
Yeah. Well, can I say, so in every way, you know, Polly's family shows us the way. Because I do think there's something really interesting that has happened if you stand back from the political parties, which is there was a party at this general election which had a truly different manifesto. So I appreciate your point, Gus, about the fact that there was a good deal of it, which was a rebadging of, you know, social democratic centre-left. But there were elements of it in the programme of nationalisations that were fundamentally different. And that manifesto was rejected. And on the other side, you had a Conservative manifesto, which, as someone nicely put it, if it had been a budget, it would have felt thin, right? So a manifesto that was substantial was rejected, and a manifesto with next to nothing in it was voted in with a colossal majority, which means that we have a government that, beyond Brexit, we cannot predict. Right? That its economics and its social policies and its plans, which went entirely undiscussed for Britain's place in the world, in things beyond just trade, are completely unpredictable. And at the same time, the space for politics in the centre and on the left is now a blank sheet once again. And I just end by saying that there are probably two things that you can take away from that. One is we're going to go back to a world where politics is background noise for the first time in 5-6 years. We're going to have a general election, most likely in 2024. We've got 5 years until the next one, and people will look away from politics and get back to their lives. My expectation is that doesn't mean that political passions will recede, but they will move into vehicles that are not party politics, that are not Westminster, and different forms of activism. That's potentially a really exciting thing and gives us each something to do. But there is also, I think, a second piece of work, which is the thing I suspect, you know, Polly's talking about there, which is there is a philosophical argument to be had about whether or not the politics that dominated since the Second World War, which was a politics essentially that was inherited from the 19th century, between capital and labour, between, you know, factories and banks, that politics is actually now transformed, and the arguments between left and right don't hold in a world transformed by technology, with an urgent climate crisis, with a population that's aging and living very, very differently, with people who have very fundamentally different sense of who they are and how the state perceives that. And the invigorating thing, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, whether you're a Tory who voted for someone but don't quite know what the manifesto means, or you're Labour who hoped for something and didn't get it, the one thing I do think that's invigorating is the possibility that this next period, this next 5 years, is a time that we can and surely need to reimagine that. So I hope that you won't always have to get up quite so early off so little sleep to come in and discuss that in our newsroom in Tortoise, but I genuinely hope that in the next few months and years that's exactly what we'll get to do. Thank you for joining us. Can I say I don't normally toot our horn quite so much, but a huge thank you, particularly to all of this sort of, not you, Charles, because obviously you've had a nice snooze, but all of the people here in this circle here who've not slept a wink since about 6 o'clock yesterday morning.
You made us come in for a meeting at 9 a.m. yesterday.
Yeah.
Yes.
Seems a long time ago.
It's a long yards, but a huge thank you. When they're not sleep deprived, I tell you, they're very, very good. Thank you very much indeed.